Hello and welcome to the Marshall McAdam Data and Analytics Podcast, the hangout for inspirational leaders in data, technology and AI in Australia. I'm your host, Tim Hutchinson, and I'm delighted to be joined by Joel Nicholson today, the CEO of Lemon Tree Fundraising. Joel and I are going to explore all things data and AI related in the context of the social impact sector and the charitable sector, and are also going to look at the collaborative sharing of data. Before that, we're also going to explore Joel's somewhat unorthodox path to where he is today. We'll get into that right after this.
Welcome to the Marshall McAdam Data and Analytics Podcast, where Australian business leaders and experts discuss the data challenges facing organisations today and the opportunities for innovative business in the future. Let's get the conversation started.
So welcome, Joel.
Thanks, Tim.
Great.
Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here. I've introduced you as In fact, I'll give you one of these, Joel. Everyone's delighted.
A fraction perhaps over the top, but thanks anyway.
I've introduced you as CEO of Lemon Tree Fundraising. However, I also mentioned, and you and I have actually known each other a long time, I've mentioned that you had an orthodox journey to get to where you are today. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how unorthodox that journey is.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure which story you want me to tell here, Tim, but I'll tell the story more about...
Keep it clean.
Yeah, I started out, studied physics at university and thought that was my path because mathematics was pretty high on my list. But then I decided to chase a white ball on the golf course and became a professional golfer for a while there and tried to apply all that physics to the golfing. But alas, that didn't work out, and realised there's probably easier ways to earn a living.
So are you being modest? Where did you get to in the golfing world?
I ended up playing over on the Scandinavian circuit for a season and realised that Australia is a very small pond when you go overseas in that world.
But at least you did it.
Yeah, look, no regrets, and loved it and recommend it.
So physics, golf.
And then came back to Australia and just sort of stumbled into data. In fact, my father actually ran a data management company for many years since the 70s. So kind of was in our family, but obviously like a lot of, when you look at your parents, you think, I want to do the opposite. But I fell into it. And then actually in a short period of time, really started to get fascinated by the area.
Fantastic. So you've got me thinking here, there's kids growing up typically wanting to be premiership footballers, other professional, tennis players, etc. Is the future data?
I think, good question. Look, I might have mentioned this before, but I think the future will always be data, just because it's a challenge that the world will never cease to solve. There'll be always continuous more and more data, but probably the biggest piece is that data will continually sit in many places. So to bring it all together in one spot, that reality probably will never happen. So hence there'll always be data challenges. Yeah,
okay. So as I understand it, so your dad had a business related to data, but this would be some time back when data was less prevalent.
Well, I can share a story there because back in the 70s, if you were a data person, you were a rock star. So my father actually literally got flown around in Learjets around Europe as the data guy. That's
awesome.
Whereas I can't imagine that happening these days.
Wow. So you saw a piece of that. You saw the Learjet lifestyle.
Right.
Thought that's for me.
Yep.
How's that played out?
Yeah, so I must admit, I think I've been in a helicopter, but not quite a
Brilliant.
Learjet. But
and the company. So then you talk to me about that company your dad had, and what your involvement was, etc.
Yeah, so there's a company called MarketSoft, which is, as I said, a data management company that's been around since the 70s. So it's still around today. I took over that company in 2004 and ran it for about 12 years. It's obviously in the commercial area, which once again, all about solving these data challenges, disparate data everywhere for a lot of the big banks and retailers and a lot of other sort of direct marketing companies.
And you say you ran it for 12 years. Are you still involved with Marketsoft?
Yes, still one of the owners of Marketsoft, yes.
Yeah, okay. So, and then in the introduction, I was talking about this shift I think you've made from the commercial sector to then applying your smarts, if that's the word, applying your smarts to the profit for purpose sector, which I think is where Lemon Tree comes in. But I'm keen to hear all about Lemon Tree and that journey you've been on from commercial to profit for purpose.
Yeah, well, I guess I got to learn that data can have a big impact on the world in the commercial world. But after about 12 years, I must admit my passion slowly faded a bit, just more because of what it was serving. So we tended to work in the financial services space where obviously we really promoted the ideas like customer centricity, and obviously it's all about the experience the customer can benefit from and how do you keep adding more value. And the science of that is actually continually fascinating. But we started to dabble with a few not-for-profit clients and then just started to see actually there's some real gaps in the social impact sector that the commercial area is benefiting from, and I thought we could actually transfer that across. So about 7 years ago, launched a business called Lemon Tree, which obviously leveraged a lot of the assets and data management tools that Marketsoft had of managing large sets of data. But the key idea behind there was actually this idea of collaborative data and how organizations can benefit from that. Many people would know there's actually been some really high profile cases of collaborative data working well, like in the commercial sector, where like companies like Westpac and Woolworths and realestate.com joined forces. In fact, I think NAB as well in that case, and where they share data in a de-identified way to basically understand customers deeper and wider than ever.
Yeah, right. Okay. So we'll get to that collaborative piece because that's fascinating, and I was surprised that actually takes place amongst competing organisations. But just go back a step for those people who have perhaps, dare I say, never heard of Lemon Tree, perish your thought, and want to understand really what you are and what you're trying to do. Can you expand on that a little bit for me?
Yeah. So Lemon Tree is if you can imagine, it's a big data set in the not-for-profit industry. So we've got about 85 of the largest organisations on board, like a lot of big ones like Salvation Army, Red Cross, Heart Foundation, etc. Where if you imagine all their CRM data is put together into a central analytics pot. It's all de-identified and aggregated for privacy reasons. But what we now do then have the ability to is to understand customers from across many organisations and obviously more frequently deeper into their behaviours than before. Now, obviously there's two sides of that coin. Some people would go, well, hang on, that sounds a bit Big Brother stuff that now I'm understanding too much about customers. But I on the positive side is that obviously by knowing your customer better or your donor better, you can be more effective and more closer in the relationship. So once again, it can be either used for damage or it can be used for good.
Yeah, absolutely. So 7 years ago when you launched Lemon Tree, was that your idea? Have you copied it from elsewhere in the world? What was the seed, pardon the pun, idea behind it?
Yeah, definitely. I about probably 7.5 years ago, I dabbled with the idea of collaborative data in the commercial world, where I actually did bandy together a few companies that were interested in the idea, but just never got off the ground. And then one day, sometimes it's hard to actually pin down the actual exact moment. But I think I spoke to a colleague in the industry, and he said, "Well, why don't you just do it?" And so went out and talked to the first 5 charities and said, "Look, I just need 5 to get this going, enough to get some collaboration." And they all said yes, and then off we went. And so in the next 6 years, we went from 5 to 85, and and the database went from about 100,000 donors to about 30 million donors if you...
That's absolutely phenomenal.
Add them all up, yeah.
So as you've explained, you've brought together, you've had huge success. You've brought together 80 of the leading charities who've collaborated and pooled their donor data. Perhaps go back a step for me. I'm always interested in people's kind of big picture philosophical take on the data industry and the bigger picture challenges. What's your view? What are the big challenges out there?
Yeah, well, data is obviously a very broad area these days as well. So obviously need to put it into context. But like, for example, I sort of see there's the whole data management, data engines side of the industry, and then there's all the analytical and insights side of the sector, which quite often are very different skill sets. But coming back to as a broader sort of sense of like the challenges sort of alluded to, that there will always be data challenges. So if you're in the industry, I think there will always be plenty of work out there for people. I don't think it's there's no Kodak moment in the data industry. So just probably share some of like the key like experiences we've found.
Yeah, please.
Over probably the last couple of decades that just continue on is, well, first of all, you probably hear it a lot, but data quality is just an endless world. So just getting recent information is tough because capturing data is expensive sometimes, or the right data, pulling it from multiple sources is expensive, and then to maintain that is further cost. So you can see why a lot of databases out there slowly decay, and then when it comes to the use of that data, then obviously it's diluted. So data quality is just an endless need, and possibly quite often undervalued because a lot of in the marketing world, a lot of marketing budgets are pushed towards other areas rather than that future investment. Another big challenge beyond data quality is a lot of people would have heard it, is accessing the data, like getting the data in the hands of the analyst. So I mean, like classic story, like ANZ used to be one of our big clients, and they'd have a whole team around analysts there, and they'd all get paid big salaries, and yet they'd sort of jokingly say, you know what, they pay me all this money and I possibly spend 95% of my time just pulling data together, and I actually only do about 5% true analytics.
It's frightening, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's a big gap.
So it's interesting you say that because I think in our broader client base, I think perhaps our perception years ago used to be that there was the exciting idea of predictive analytics in the future, whereas in fact, day to day we come across similar challenges constantly, which is really, do we believe in our data or data? Can we keep it safe? Can we get it to the right end user in a usable format? And how do those so those challenges you've broadly described, which of those, or how are you then applying those to your day-to-day work with Lemon Tree?
Yeah, so that's one of the other benefits of collaboration is that the whole goal is we can spread those costs amongst many clients. So obviously we invest a lot in data hygiene. So if you can imagine getting data from 85 organizations in all different shapes and forms, and making sure it's as standardized and systemized as possible. So we spend a lot of effort into the standardization and automation of that data. Probably the rule of thumb, the more manual it is, the more varied it is. And
yes.
So we're always continually trying to remove like hands out of the process. However, when you're dealing with multiple stakeholders and companies, that sometimes is not easy. But that's definitely where we need to continue to get to.
And with this collaboration, as something of a layperson in this, I'm amazed that there doesn't seem to be more resistance to sharing data, collaborating around data. Is that something you have helped to overcome, or to sell the benefits? How has that happened, that evolution?
Yeah. Well, possibly the social sector is a little bit more. Obviously, it's less about the competitiveness. So obviously, more sharing by nature. But also, it comes down to the belief of of fairness. So we spend a lot of effort actually communicating how this model is fair, and at the end of the day, if you can be, by having this collaboration, you can be 4 times more predictive than being on your own, then eventually that value proposition stacks up towards the perceived belief of maybe I'm giving away more than I'm receiving.
And do the results bear that out? If you can share the upside that your charity client base has experienced, hopefully?
Yeah, well, probably the simplest message we started out years ago was that well, probably a lot of people know that people don't just give to one charity; they tend to give to those who tend to give to 3, 4, 5 or more.
Okay, yep.
So understanding that your donor is just not your donor, and it's the same in the commercial world. Your customer is not just your customer. So what we have proven back then as well is that by knowing those in the community who give to 2 or more charities are essentially 4 times more likely to give to a 3rd or 4th.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So just that one simple piece of knowledge is quite powerful. However, you can imagine, and this is where analytics gets interesting, because the obvious then is, well, just give me a lot more of those people that give to it. And
yes.
And that's when it spirals into unsustainability, because then all of a sudden the same people get hit up by many messages and communications, and they get worn out. And that's when that's where part of the reason we started Lemon Tree was that was actually happening already in the industry by other providers.
So if I understand it right, by you guys at Lemon Tree, for want of a better word, controlling that group of donors, you can therefore control the approaches to them and sensibly manage that access to donors, presumably.
Yeah, and start to put a lot more sort of rules and safeguards in place, like don't go to the same person more than X amount of times over a given period, and also create that sustainability. So that's a big part in what we do.
And I'm guessing the answer is yes to this question, but presumably there's some fairly intense analytical insight happening around exactly that, which is who you approach, how often you approach people, what the response rate is, and there's a continual loop. Is there a feedback loop? Yeah.
Like we get asked by certain charities like, oh, we've got this big attrition problem amongst our donors, and you can do simple things like just start taking a look at their email communications, and if all of a sudden there's their customers are receiving 85 emails in the space of 3 months, all fairly untargeted, you can see why that group starts dropping off, whereas people who actually have maybe had less communications, we find then you get a better retention rate. So obviously, case by case.
Absolutely. So you've clearly made massive inroads into developing this space for the social sector. Have you solved the problem, or what's the next opportunity really to again create profit for purpose and to help organisations?
Yeah, no, I feel like a long way away still. Yeah, look, the road is it's an exciting one, but we definitely see a world where we help the charities really become that whole sustainable engine. I mean, the industry as a whole, obviously in the media quite a lot, often get bad press. I mean, you probably around the bushfire period this time last year, there was plenty of negative press around perhaps charities are not using the money in the right way, or spending too much of it on fundraising. So the very, very small margins actually going to the end cause. So I see the world where we can actually create far more efficient relationships with donors to the right, ultimately marketing 101 to the right donors, the right place, and build long-term trusting relationships, which starts to speak to the idea of bringing that idea of customer centricity or donor centricity, bringing relationships and data together so that actually that becomes a sustainable outcome.
Absolutely.
Yep.
That leads to so many questions. I mean, one of the things that springs to mind therefore is how either historically or now do marketers and fundraisers value the data or value the donor? How do they quantify that?
Yeah, it's changing. It's always been a bit of a tug of war because of short-term milestones like return on investment, quarter by quarter. Quite often is demanded by senior management, and so whereas as we know, relationships don't happen quarter by quarter; they happen over many years. In fact, the best relationships are the longest ones. So how do you bring together those two opposite forces? So this is where we're doing a lot of work around what I believe it's data is part of the solution, but it's actually the experience that the supporter feels married with the data that you can start to grow those relationships. And then coupled with that is actually starting to work out, well, how do we create these sort of like lifetime value type metrics better and better with the data? Often a challenge because it can get quite rubbery numbers at times. But we need to get to that place because otherwise we'll always fall back to short-term ROI, and it doesn't marry well with relationship building.
It's interesting listening to you though. My sense is, and I do know some of your backstory, your experience from the commercial world when applied to the social sectors is actually incredibly valuable, because you're almost talking about some of the pitfalls of a short-term cycle that the commercial world often reports on, and then you're applying the whole longer-term customer-centric bit. So I think your journey to where you are with Lemon Tree has presumably helped you, and you've seen both sides of the fence and understand how things work.
Yeah, and probably been seeing it for 20 plus years. So really, working hard in Lemon Tree world to see if we can actually change the thinking and thinking more long term.
I think I've known you for some of those 20 years, Joel, because I seem to recall doing some work with you that involved COBOL green screens or COBOL on green screens. Yeah,
that was a while ago, but actually, they still say it's something like half the world's code is still written in COBOL, so it's still out there. I don't see it myself, but obviously,
there's still some systems chugging away somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I also wanted to talk to you. You talked about removing hands from the process, which to minimize errors and improve accuracy. So presumably that gets us into the oft covered area of AI, machine learning, etc. My guess is, I may be wrong, but my guess is that's an ethical minefield within the charitable sector. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, it's evolving. Like it's probably, this is where the charity sector is a bit behind the commercial sector. AI and machine learning's realistically only been in the sector for about the last sort of like 3 to 5 years.
Okay.
Before that, it was more sort of mostly your sort of segmentation and a little bit of predictive analysis or modelling.
But what would be an example now then of, to someone who's just not aware of the progress in those 3 to 5 years, what would be an example of the application of AI within the charitable sector? Yeah.
So from a Lemon Tree perspective, we build these various modelled segmentations based on machine learning. So like literally just throw at it a heck of a lot of data and let it essentially cluster up these groups of people that you wouldn't normally associate with each other, but they've got these commonalities that actually bring them together. Now, those sort of ways of looking at your donors would never have been possible before, but now they are. I guess, we do.
And am I right in thinking there's an ethical risk there in terms of, within a machine learning example where there become preferences for certain groups at the expense of others? Is that an ethical risk?
Yeah, well, might have mentioned that definitely at the executive level, we're getting the feedback quite often from a lot of the major charities that they see there's some issues around AI and applying.
What's troubling them?
This is it. I think it's also knowledge and understanding and education, because I think if you take a partial understanding of what the value is and what it's doing, then you're not really in a strong position to have a clear opinion. I guess I can talk to our experiences. So work with a lot of like data scientists in our team and externally. And interestingly, there's a real theoretical view that AI doesn't always work anyway. It actually quite often doesn't prove anything. And we see it actually can be very open that quite a lot of our models don't do anything. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. And I think that's the nature of some of the predictive analytics.
Sorry, forgive me. When you say they don't work, how do you determine they don't work, or is it that they work but they find out that there's no pattern, for example? What do you mean they don't work?
Yeah, well, I guess when you're correlating it to performance. So when you pick a certain group where you're basically saying this group is a high predictability or likelihood to convert or upgrade, or and then all of a sudden it actually is pretty much equal to a control group which has had no scoring, then that's pretty much saying this model's not really giving much value at all. So it can be really...
But sorry, I might be missing the point here, but is this we see these contradictions sometimes with, for example, managers in a finance team, for example, where, sorry to managers in finance teams, but they may have a gut feel or think they know a pattern of behavior or a pattern of financial performance, etc. And then the data, when analysed in cold, hard facts, doesn't back up their feeling. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. Is that the disconnect there?
Yeah, so potentially, or this is where the world we do live in, there's chaos as well, so and randomness. So whether we can actually let mathematics basically find that pattern consistently in a world of chaos is theoretically open to opinion, because I think some of the world's leading data scientists would view that sometimes AI doesn't actually predict.
Thanks, Joel. That's fascinating. So looking ahead, what's going to keep you busy from a data perspective in the next year?
Good question. It looks like it's going to be a busy year ahead. So definitely, specifically on the data side, we're actually spending a lot more effort in. We've talked about earlier about removing the hands, so being more automated, and really that starts to really play out with data quality and recency and so forth. So that's actually a really simple but massive step forward for us to really drive that. Probably some interesting stuff where we're playing around with a lot of social media audiences and building up those groups of people, and then marrying those groups with different data points, and ultimately nurturing those relationships. And probably thirdly, it's this expanding world I talked about before, is this coupling between supporter experiences and data. So because each on their own do their job, but bringing those together is where I think the magic happens. So a lot of experimentation around those two worlds.
And on the basis to achieve that, you've presumably got to innovate. Are you the innovator here, or do you learn from others? How do you continue to keep pushing forward in a space that's changing continually?
Yeah, so definitely sort of see myself as a bit of an entrepreneur in that space. So I've always, for some reason, ideas pop in to mind. Usually they come out of conversations with customers, I've got to say. But then it's the danger is actually having almost...
I was about to ask you whether they come to you in the shower classically, but probably not if it's conversations with customers. So,
no. Yeah, right, okay, yeah. So definitely most of the ideas, or I could almost sort of say almost all ideas come from client meetings. It's almost like that, what's that? I can't remember that acronym of nothing. This is probably hopefully it doesn't offend people, but nothing important happens in your own office. It's getting out and actually talking to others is where the best ideas come from. And I've found pretty much that's been my source of all ideas. But the danger being is that you can end up with too many ideas and end up being spread across too many. So that's probably more the challenge.
So actually, you're not giving the answer I might have expected, which is that you look to the US, for example. That people often say there's a more mature market, particularly when we're in Australia. And I don't mean to offend Australia either, but often it's the US that's leading. Is that not the case?
Yeah, no, I think definitely in the fundraising space, there's areas where Australia's leading. In fact, we're looking at taking certain programs over to the US, where it's almost like green fields.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So
Exciting. You're the next big export, Joel.
Oh, well, I will say that probably the UK actually in the fundraising world is a bit ahead of Australia. So there's a bit of importing there going on.
Fair enough. So there's a couple of things I want to ask you. The decision you made, if it was a decision, or the calling you have, let's say, to have gone from the commercial world to supporting the social sector increasingly, good decision, good move?
Unequivocally say happier is probably the first word that comes to mind.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
So then it leads on to, if others want to apply their skills in the data and analytics space for good, any advice? What are the top tips?
Yeah. Well, I guess top tips in general, I always think like you should always surround yourself by obviously smarter people and especially in data, some at least one or two good data scientists somewhere in your world, because they've just got that sort of thought leadership and you can learn lots from. So we've been fortunate to have that. I think also once again, a lot of my ideas have all come from client meetings. As a data person, just force yourself to actually turn up to some client meetings with your colleagues if possible, because that's where you can get some really unique insight. And then possibly if you want to actually move from this sort of commercial world to the for-profit world, we have this sort of big donor-centricity collaborative in the industry where we have about 2,000 people involved, where we share a lot of information. We have quarterly catch-ups.
And when you say we, that's we Lemon Tree?
Yeah, it's a Lemon Tree run group community. So encourage people to jump on there.
You're being modest, Joel. So again, you've created something there, by the sounds of it, with 800, 1,000?
Yeah, we've got a couple of thousand on the database, but in terms of people turning up to the quarterly events over the last 4 or 5 years, we've had probably close to 1,000 people.
Fantastic. Yeah. So that begs the question, how do people get hold of you?
Definitely visit our website, lemontree.com.au, and our details are there, and love you to join. We have various communities and news groups, and I'm a big believer that collectives solve better problems than individuals.
Fantastic. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here.
Yeah,
I've really enjoyed it. Hopefully the listeners have learned a little bit about an area that they may have been less aware of beforehand.
Yep.
Really enjoyed it.
And likewise, Tim, thanks for having me along, and also really inspired by what you're doing as well. A very big focus on the data and analytics space, and really think you're onto some great, interesting journeys ahead.
Fantastic. As you said, there's a lot to learn. It's never changing, so it's always changing. So we'll never be out of work.
Yep.
Good stuff. Thank you, Joel.
Cheers,
Absolute
Tim.
pleasure.
Bye,
Cheers.
mate.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining. This podcast was brought to you by Marshall McAdam, creating talent solutions in data, technology, transformation and finance across Australia. If you enjoyed the conversation, don't forget to leave a comment, subscribe and share. If you'd like to get in touch with the Marshall McAdam team, simply send an email, visit the website or connect on LinkedIn. Contact details can be found in the description. See you next time.